So that news conference with President Putin and the Belarusian leader just ending, and a significant couple of statements from Vladimir Putin saying that Russia agrees with a Ukraine ceasefire, but it should lead to an enduring peace and should remove the underlying causes of the crisis. But he did talk about nuances. Let us just listen in to two of the key clips that we saw there with President Putin. He's been meeting the Belarusian leader, both, of course, very, very strongly aligned. But both took questions on this key question of Ukraine, because Donald Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, is in Moscow and is due to be meeting President Putin imminently, we understand. Let's just listen to the first clip that we've got to play you from what Mr. Putin has just been saying.
We agree with the proposal for a ceasefire, to cease hostilities, but we proceed from the fact that this ceasefire should lead to an enduring peace and should remove the root causes of this crisis. Now, whether Ukraine is ready to cease hostilities, the meeting in Saudi Arabia between Ukraine and America may look like a decision taken by the Ukrainian side under American pressure. But in fact, we are absolutely convinced that the Ukrainian side should have asked Americans for this persistently, given the situation on the ground.
And President Putin actually started those particular remarks by saying he wanted to thank Mr. Trump for giving so much attention to getting a settlement in Ukraine. He also thanked the leaders of China, India, Brazil and South Africa, all dealing with this question and trying to get a ceasefire and stop the human loss. Well, although President Putin agreed to stop the fighting, he said there were many things needed for a ceasefire to go ahead.
It would be good for the Ukrainian side to achieve at least a 30-day ceasefire, and we are in favor of it. But there are nuances. What are they? First of all, what are we going to do about this incursion in Kursk region? If we ceased hostilities for 30 days, what would that mean? Would that mean that everybody there would leave? Should we release them after they have committed numerous crimes against civilians there? Or will the Ukrainian leadership command them to surrender?
President Putin there speaking at that news conference in the last hour. Well, let me just speak to Peter Zwack, who's a retired American brigadier general, served in the Obama administration as a military attaché to the US Embassy in Russia and was in Moscow when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014. First of all, just give me your overall reaction. Thank you for staying with us and watching that. But what do you make of what we've just heard from President Putin?
This was very significant. I think that the Russians, over the last few days, since the Ukrainians and U.S. met and agreed to the limited ceasefire, that put Russia back on the back step. We had the initiative. They've taken the initiative back somewhat, and they have been able to answer these questions looking reasonable, and they got a lot done. The fact that they could agree it, and then they also, I think, inferred their own red lines with that, and what goes on during the peace, during the ceasefire, and during peace, which is exactly what our position had been. And so I think this was very much aimed at us in the coalition, and I think it sets the table for the discussion with Steve Witkoff in Moscow. If we remember, just a couple weeks ago, broke out Mark Vogel, who had been in Russian jail for a number of years, and I believe Witkoff met Putin at that time. So yes, this has really opened the scrum.
And very interesting that he said initially that we agree with the proposals for the ceasefire, but it should lead to the ending of this in peace and to look at the root causes of the crisis. What do you think President Putin meant by that?
Well, I think it's another way to lay out his red lines, and that's going to be where the discussion is what are the Ukrainian equities? The Ukrainian equities is getting getting their land back, their 18 to 20% taken since February 22, or something less than that. But they're not going to give any new land to Russia. And then the cessation of hostilities is going to be very important. Who gets between them? And as we saw with the Minsk Accord, the OSCE tried, and it was very difficult. And then there's the court of world opinion. I think that, again, Ukraine had, with the U.S. and allies, had gotten the initiative, and Putin has partially taken it back. So it's going to be a very dynamic 10 days. And who knows?
And he talked about, Mr. Putin said maybe there'll be a phone call with President Trump, thanking President Trump for his attention to this. Of course, we should remember that those two leaders had a long phone call just a matter of weeks ago. And then we saw Donald Trump's administration putting a huge amount of pressure on the Ukrainians to concede to US demands. And then, of course, the US withdrew intelligence. On Kursk, President Putin asked, publicly there, what happens in future? What happens to prisoners? Should they be released? He was putting pressure on the Ukrainians really to leave, because he said if there's a physical blockade, nobody will be able to leave. They have to surrender or die. So he was saying that meant that it was good, in his view, that Ukraine should have a 30-day ceasefire. Do you think that Russian success in Kursk in the last few days has been helped by the fact that the US withdrew intelligence sharing?
I mean, yes, of course. But it came back in a week. It hurt, but was not strategically decisive, though it would have been if the combat persisted. So we've kind of, our positions are kind of sort of meeting in the middle, but as we all know, there are the devil's in the details, and there is a lot of ground for additional confrontation, violence, and showmanship, and so what Putin did do, I think he felt under pressure. And he had to say something. And in the context of talking with the Belarusian president, that was also very interesting, because that borders both. And the Russians have used Belarus as a staging point, but the Belarusians did not, with main forces, cross into Ukraine. So there's a big swirl going on here.
Just finally, very interesting that he, again, at the end, talked about negotiating with US friends and partners, as he put it, and talked, as you said, about who decides if there's a violation along the 2,000-kilometre contact line, who is blamed for any violations. And those issues need to be painstakingly studied by both sides, said Vladimir Putin. How long do you think something like that can take to resolve? Because obviously there's a lot of pressure now from the US on achieving a quick ceasefire.
Yes, and absolutely from the US, President Trump wants this bad. I think that Putin does not. But he's reluctant, but he is now putting a different face forward to get tactical advantage, or at least equality. And there will be, a real indicator, barometer will there will be skirmishes. You don't get complete disciplined silence in this type of conflict. Will there be things going on in the rear areas? But a month, both sides, good faith effort. I think that's what both sides will insist on. And the negotiations behind the scenes will be hard. And the pressure on, will there be peacekeepers or anything like that? Don't know. It's very volatile. And a lot of anger out there, but at least everybody is now talking. As of 12 hours ago, they were not.
Peter Zwack, a retired American Brigadier General, formerly a military attaché to the US Embassy in Russia. Thank you very much indeed for being with us today.
All the best.
Let's bring in our correspondent Tom Bateman, who is travelling with the US press delegation to the G7 in Canada and is in Quebec. Tom, a really fascinating news conference and some statements from President Putin. How significant is what he said?
It's extremely significant because it is Vladimir Putin's response to the American and Ukrainian joint proposal for an immediate ceasefire. Remember, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, had said the ball is now in Putin's court, in Russia's court. Well, what Mr. Putin has just done is picked it up and thrown it straight back at the White House. Because what he is saying here basically is, OK, we accept all of this in principle. We like the idea of an end to the conflict, but here are a series of questions that have not come with this proposal. So he is saying things like, well, how would you police and monitor a ceasefire? He was saying critically, will the Ukrainians just walk out of Kursk? And those front lines then move back to the border? Because this was always a sort of fundamental issue with what Mr. Trump was demanding, which is that you do the ceasefire first and then you have the negotiations. Now, generally, that isn't how ceasefires work, because a ceasefire is an agreement between two sides. So usually you have a process of negotiating the agreement, and the ceasefire is part of that implementation. But it would always include things like, well, what are troop movements going to be during that process, and prisoner exchanges and all of the rest of it. What does the ceasefire actually mean and involve? So Mr. Putin, I think, is identifying the weaknesses in the proposal, and he's throwing them straight back at Mr. Trump. So I expect, we've heard him say that publicly, it's likely then he'll say something quite similar to Steve Witkoff, his envoy, who is in Moscow, and that message will be reported back to Donald Trump. So we have to wait to see what he's going to say to this. But remember, Mr. Trump's position was always he wants an immediate ceasefire. He wants to end the war. He said he could do it in a day, and we're seeing now that they got the Ukrainians on board with that, but that was very much due to the arm-wrenching from Washington to Kyiv, withdrawing military support, that they pushed them to the table and got them to sign up to this agreement, albeit that the Ukrainians are saying publicly they absolutely welcome this, that it was part of their idea, that they do want this. But I think now we're starting to see how this process is going to become entangled, and that Mr. Putin is sort of saying in principle he goes along with it, but of course attaching a whole list of questions to it.
Tom Bateman, thank you very much there, live in Quebec.